So hello and welcome to another interview as part of the Ukie Need to Know series. That's when I have the pleasure of spending some time with individuals that are changing the games industry of today and the future. And we talk about some really interesting and hot topics. I'm delighted to be joined today by Lori Meakin from The Others and Me. Hello, Lori.
Hi, lovely to be here.
Lovely to see you too. And we've got a conversation looking at gender today with the fairly provocative title, actually, What About Men? Making gender inclusion truly inclusive. So really interested to get into that. Just very briefly, though, I noticed you've got a talk lined up at Develop in Brighton this year. That's fabulous. What are you going to be talking about there?
Yeah, I'm really excited and honoured actually to be there because I know it's a really big deal within the industry. I'm going to be talking about actually sort of more detail on a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about here today, about how do we build cultures and products that are that just serve all of our audience better and create a future that's good for business and good for society. Because again, I think it's really important that it shouldn't be either or.
Mhm.
So I'm going to be talking a lot about that and hopefully giving people some insights and a bit of inspiration to actually want to do things differently. Because I think so often this conversation always feels like someone having a like just nagging and telling everybody off. So hopefully it won't be that.
Inspiration, that's what we need. Thank you for that. Let's see if
Well,
you
let's
can bring
hope.
it, well, let's keep an eye out for that one down in Develop, and I'll certainly come along and have a good listen to that. I suppose let's start with a fairly broad opening then, just to get us
Yeah.
warmed up. So, why do we need to change the conversation about gender in the games industry?
Yeah, it's a good question. And again, I think importantly, it's not just in the games industry. It's sort of we need to do this everywhere because, like in society as a whole, there are issues that actually around gender that often go unnoticed that I started sort of researching a few years ago that kind of blew my mind when I realized what's going on. Because I think it's easy to think because we've come a long way that sort of the job's done and the
Mm.
big priorities are other things when it comes to sort of inclusion. But really interestingly, we're seeing a backlash happening now. So there has been a lot of progress. But right now in Britain, 59% of men say gender equality has gone so far, but we're now actively discriminating against men. It was 53% last year, it's now 59%. And a lot of people I talk to find that quite shocking, actually, or surprising as a number. But I think what all of my work is about is kind of going, right, we need to really understand what's going on here. And we need to understand what it is about men and men's experiences that are making them say that. Because like men aren't idiots. They're not evil. They're not bad. They're experiencing the world in a way that feels like it's not working for them. And if gender equality feels like it's not working for them, then we need to take that seriously and we need to understand like why and what's driving that. So that's why I spent 2 years researching and then writing a book that's called No More Minimies. Can I give it a little plug? There
Oh,
it
look
is.
at that. Yeah.
Available exclusively on Amazon at the moment. But basically, I spent 2 years really trying to understand what is the state of play, because so often we hear about what's going on for women, and there are still significant barriers and disadvantages for women, but we don't often talk about what about men. And it's so important because there's a lot of things, a lot of challenges that men are facing, a lot of reasons that they don't feel involved in conversations, that they feel kind of threatened or underserved in a whole bunch of areas. Men's mental health is one of the ones that does get talked about a little bit, maybe, but still not enough. So really trying to understand like what does the world feel like for men as well, so we can build a world that works better for all of us, because we can't solve a problem if we're only looking at half of it. So that's what my work's all about. We need to include men in gender equality conversations, otherwise it's just not going to work.
That's fascinating and a really interesting perspective. I don't know whether my next question's still relevant then, because I was wanting to talk about is one of the solutions to get more women into the games industry so that we can have a broader debate and more conversation about this. Do you think
Yeah.
that is still something that we should be trying to focus on accelerating?
Yeah, I do. And I think it's really important that it's one of the things we do, but it can't be the only thing we do. So,
Right.
and that's kind of for a few reasons. So, again, if we go back to business, because I think it's really important that we start all of these conversations from a business point of view. And we know that more gender diverse teams are proven to drive greater profitability, greater growth, and they do that through kind of creating greater innovation and creativity within teams. So like that's all really well proven. I think the interesting thing is when we get beyond just like, it's really easy, I think, to think that getting a mix of the right people in the room will solve the problem. But it doesn't always work. And there's kind of three reasons for that. So one is that if, in this case, women, it works with other kind of minoritized people as well. But if someone is very much still the minority, then they tend to be, there's something called the Smurfette principle that goes on with women in particular. I don't know if you remember the Smurfs.
I know the Smurfs.
The
I've never.
Smurf.
Is this a proper principle or something you've made up, Laurie?
No, I know, I wish I had because it's
Okay.
brilliantly named. But it's basically based on analysis that was done. So when the Smurfs were first created like years ago, as a cast of characters, there were 99 of them, I believe. And all of the male characters, most of them were men, right? So there was Papa Smurf, and there was a kind of geeky Smurf, and there was a funny Smurf, and there was a sporty Smurf, and there was a Smurfette, right? There
Right.
was one, first of
One
all,
one woman, one
one
female.
woman.
Yeah.
The important thing about that is her character became woman. That was just
Right.
like, or girl. That's what
Mm.
defined her. And what we see sometimes is what happens in cultures. And if you get a group of people together and only one or two of them are a minoritized group, you sort of expect them to speak for in their entire, like half of the population. And they don't get to have like diversity of character and experience that everybody else gets. So that's one thing to watch out for. Like, is Smurfette principle going on? Happens as well with people of color. Are we expecting a person of color in the room to speak for the kind of global majority? Because it's
Mm.
like we need to respect people's lived experiences, but we mustn't expect that person to represent everybody of their type. The other thing that can happen that we need to watch out for is like, especially when a company has a really strong culture, a monoculture can develop quite quickly. So diverse people come in, but then they start behaving in the same way that everybody is expected to behave in that company, which can often mean women can sort of channel their inner white guy a lot of the time. But the most interesting thing, I think, and a lot of my work has uncovered, there's a load of things that women don't understand about gender equality as well. Like part of that is, where are we excluding men and what does life feel like when you're a man? But even with things like products and services, it will kind of have an impact because, for instance, cars, I think, are fascinating. It happens in physical product design with things as expensive as cars. So cars are still built around a woman's body because most people don't know that actually women's bodies are fundamentally different shapes in the musculature and the pelvis shape, as well as different sizes. And like medicine is generally kind of built around cells that happen to be male without
Right.
people realizing that. So like there's all kinds of things that we're missing, and women do it as well. So for instance, women tend to think that their sons are cleverer than their daughters. They overestimate their IQ by 10 IQ points. We think little boys are faster and stronger, even though before puberty they're absolutely not. And women do that as well. So there's lots that we're all missing that we could understand better. So just having more women in the room isn't enough if it doesn't create those different cultures, diversity of character and point of view, and particularly if it doesn't help us overcome those blind spots.
Yeah, lots to think about there.
Yeah.
This is a lot. There's a lot more to
There's
this
a
than
lot,
I
it's a
perhaps
lot, I'm sorry.
originally thought. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. We're only really going to be scratching the surface of that
Yeah.
here today, to be honest. And I just want to ask a little bit more question about, we're focusing on trying to get more women in the industry, which makes absolute logical
Yeah,
sense. But we have to focus on retention as well,
yeah,
don't we? Isn't that an enormous challenge for sectors? It's all well and good recruiting people from diverse backgrounds, but
yeah.
how do you look after them? That's a big challenge, isn't it?
It is. And I think a lot of this stuff, and as you say, it is a lot. There's like so much that we need to uncover and understand. I think if we start seeing that as opportunity rather than problem, that
Mm,
can really help. Because actually, kind of going, if we create spaces where we are trying to solve these problems and seize these opportunities together, that immediately creates a culture that's like focused on the future in a positive way, and where everyone feels like they've everyone's got a role to play. And in terms of culture and product development, it's just going to be a place where people want to stay, including women. And again, I think one of the big issues from all the data I've seen is that people coming in and then discovering that actually the culture doesn't allow them to feel like they can properly express themselves, like there are kind of barriers to the way they're understood or whatever, that can cause all kinds of frustrations that again are expensive for business as well as not seizing these opportunities.
I don't like to put people in boxes, but we're going to have a quick chat about Gen Z.
Yeah.
So the Gen Z are generally viewed as being perhaps a little bit more progressive in matters of diversity inclusion,
Yeah.
and I think there's assumption in some industries that naturally they will be the ones to solve these problems and issues and challenges we have
Yeah.
just through natural development. What do you think of that?
Yeah, and this is fascinating. This is one of the things that I was most surprised about when I discovered this data. And I think it's not very well known at all, which is really fascinating, which is that I'd assumed that as well, right? I'd
Mm,
assumed, and especially because I live in a relatively kind of inclusive, forward-thinking, progressive little bubble. And that is the case when I look at a lot of the Gen Z around me. Interestingly, though, when you look at the picture more broadly, again in Britain, that same data I talked about earlier, about kind of 59% of men saying gender equality has gone too far and they're being discriminated against. All of those figures are stronger amongst Gen Z men than they are amongst men of my age,
oh,
which I was really surprised about. And there's been the FT and The Economist have talked about this recently, actually. I've been banging on about it for a couple of years, and the stories are now starting to get picked up. So there's an academic called Alice Evans, who's a visiting fellow, I think, at Stanford at the moment. But she was talking about how actually there are kind of two Gen Zs rather than just one, because what's happening is we're seeing over time, and it's accelerating faster, women in Gen Z are increasingly kind of progressive in all kinds of measures. So they're saying when it comes to gender equality, we need to go faster, but that means they're more progressive in all kinds of areas. And we're seeing increasingly numbers of men, young men, who are doing the opposite, who are saying, actually, we've gone too far. We need to be a bit more conservative in a whole bunch of areas. And that's creating this massive, like, widening gap between the way men and women are understanding the world and feeling about all kinds of things. And then obviously algorithms and influencers exacerbate and stoke those divisions. And then you put cancel culture on top of that, this sense that if you say the wrong thing, it could be absolutely catastrophic for you.
mm.
And there's a lot going on within Gen Z that's actually something that I think we all need to understand a bit better and lean into to try and solve. Because if we leave it, it's going to keep getting worse. It's not going to get any better.
Do you get a sense there's enough sort of research investigation being done into some of these challenges?
I honestly don't. Well, I think interestingly, a lot of people probably have the data sitting in front of them, but maybe they
Right.
don't look at it in the right way. So, like, are
Mm,
we looking at it kind of intersectionally? Are we looking at Gen Z men and women? Are we looking at, again, obviously, where race and gender intersects is a massive issue. So, not just looking at race and then gender, but looking at what happens, because for women of color, a lot of the things that I talk about and work with are massively exacerbated. And the same for men, because the way masculinity is racialized and like racism is gendered, gender exclusion is racist. It's like we have to look at the data we've got through a different lens, as well as genuinely do a bit more research and understanding to work out why is this going on. Again, I think it's really important that I'm not saying Gen Z men are terrible. I'm saying Gen Z men are misunderstood. And
mm.
there's a load of stuff that's going on that they don't even feel like they can talk about. And we need to address that.
Gosh, this is layers upon layers. So more research needed, but it sounds like also interpretation of data is crucial in that. So taking insight away from it, that's a real.
Yeah.
But if we get down to, there's some great stuff here. I love this. This is really fascinating, and we could talk for hours. But can we get to some sort of practical things?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
if we think about, fine, there are challenges. We accept there are challenges. There are things we need to work on and improve on. But for people listening now, are there some practical steps that people can start doing now to start making a difference right now? What can they
Yeah,
do?
absolutely. And I think it is so important that, like, step one is recognize that we've got a problem. And then,
Mm,
that is really important, because a lot of the time we don't realize this. I think there's sort of two areas that we can work on. So one is internal kind of leadership culture, recruitment, retention, all that kind of stuff. And I think the really simple thing to do there is to go, what happens when we look beyond just the numbers? How do we create cultures where diversity of thought and experience is really valued, positively valued, and where we can find ways, whatever ways we can, of getting past this like us versus them. I call it the menemies mindset. The idea that like men are inevitably the enemy. When we talk about gender, men are at best the problem, at worst the enemy. How do we get past that in our cultures? And how do we create teams who are genuinely like compassionate and curious about each other, and that want to know what does life feel like for other people, that are data driven as well, because there's so much data out there. And I think there's just like there's loads that we can do in terms of culture if we go, okay, this isn't just a problem that's too scary for us to look at. It's an opportunity to build teams where we can all have, you know, creativity and curiosity and insight about each other. I think the other thing as well, then, that's really helpful is to go, how do we take this into our products? Because it's all going on with our audiences as well, right? And this is where I think the games industry is so interesting and so powerful, because what everybody who creates games is doing things that people want, to spend time with, and they love and enjoy. And that's a brilliant way to start addressing some of these problems. And there's all kinds of insight that exists in different areas where we go, one thing is we could take a problem and go, how might that be a solution? Because like every problem is an opportunity to create something that's like competitive advantage, right? So even things that look really depressing. So men's mental health, there's a crisis of men's mental health. Suicide's biggest killer of men under 45. That's really shocking. But if we go like, we know that the way men tend to like having conversations, men don't open up as much as women do, largely because of the way they're socialized. Men like having what's called shoulder to shoulder conversations, where you talk when you're doing something else, right? Most mental health providers don't recognize that, and they tend to want to have intense conversations that are more like the kind of female coded, feminine coded conversation. But like when gamers play together, there is so much like sitting side by side in different rooms, but doing something together. Like, where are there opportunities amongst that to enable men to express a bit more emotion, or to just to check in on each other? Like, there could be opportunities there. And there's one other that I think, looking at other industries and finding all the research that exists out there that's just fascinating. So there's one about playgrounds. I
Okay.
can just take a minute to explain.
Right.
That's really fascinating because I think it's got a really good corollary. So, there's like a received wisdom that when it comes to school playgrounds, especially younger kids, girls aren't as physical. They don't do as much physical play as boys, right? I believed that for years. I was a teacher for ages. Thought I saw that with my own eyes. What's really interesting is some researchers have come along and had a proper look at it and gone, hang on, what are we missing? And what they saw is that is true when you think play means sport. So
Right.
what generally boys football tends to take over most of the playground. But actually, when you literally look in the margins, what's going on at the edges, you see girls doing handstands and cartwheels and making up dances. So like, first thing is, what are we missing? Oh, actually play could be all kinds of things. And it's also like a lot of the time what the girls would be doing is kind of creative play, where they're making up stories and characters and building little worlds. What's fascinating is that when the academics spotted this, they built playgrounds that actually shared the space more equally. So they had half of it dedicated to ball sports and half of it where they kind of encouraged the kind of play that was going on within the margins. What happened as a result was that actually not just did the girls feel more comfortable about sharing some of the kind of football space as well, but lots of the boys started playing that kind of feminine coded play that had been going on in the margins, and actually really enjoyed that as well. And I think that's just such an interesting kind of analogy for what kinds of activities are going on in the margins that we might be missing. What happens if we look at it a little bit differently? And really importantly, not just how can we be getting more women into stuff that's been traditionally masculine coded, but like, where are there opportunities for men to be able to enjoy some of the things that society just hasn't really made available to them, but actually that when they do it, they can really enjoy as well.
That's fascinating. The idea of coding and being driven down certain routes and led down certain routes is fascinating.
Yeah.
There's a lot more to come from this, and I know you've plugged your book already, but maybe you should hold it up once more just so that we can see the name of it and what
There
it
is
looks
no
like.
more enemies
Lovely.
beyond fear and frustration of the gender wars.
Well, these are short interviews, and I'm afraid we've run out of time. But I think there'll be a lot more that we can do together, and your insight's fabulous. I'd love to hear a little bit more about it. So let's have a listen at that develop talk and take it from there. I think that will be
Absolutely.
fascinating.
Well,
But thank you so much for your time today. That's Lori Meakin from The Others and Me.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thank you.